All right, we are reading Nate Saint on a Wing and a Prayer by Janet and Geoff Benge. We are on chapter 16 titled The Legacy. While Nate was deeply missed by those who knew him, and especially by Marge and the children, his death was not the end of the Aka story or of the work of MAF in the Orient. Marge stayed on at Shelmera for 6 months after Nate's death. She faithfully manned the radio for Johnny Keenan as she continued to serve the missionaries working in the jungle. At the end of 6 months, Hobie Lawrence and his family arrived as permanent MAF replacements for Nate and Marge. Marge moved from Shelmera up to Quito, where she took over running the HCJB guest house, the same guest house she had stayed in when she first arrived in Ecuador, pregnant with Kathy. Back in Shelmera, Johnny Keenan and Hobie Lawrence continued to fly over the Aka village near the Karari River. They carried on using Nate's bucket drop system to drop gifts to the villagers. Oddly enough, the Yakas still accepted the gifts and even returned gifts of their own. Sometimes as he flew over their territory, Johnny would catch a glimpse of bright yellow strips of fabric decorating rooftops. The fabric was from Nate's Piper cruiser. Meanwhile, on Palm Beach, the remains of the Piper cruiser sank into the mud beside the Karari River and was soon completely covered. Rachel Saint continued her work learning the Aka language from Dayuma, who in the process became the first Aka Christian. Together, Dayuma and Rachel prayed that God would open up a way for the two of them to bring the gospel message to the rest of Dayuma's people. In 1958, 2 years after the deaths at Palm Beach, 2 Aka women, Mankuma and Mintaka, the older woman who had come with George and Delilah to visit the missionaries at Palm Beach, walked out of the jungle. With hand gestures, they made the Quichua Indians understand they wanted to make contact with white people. The Quichuas took them to Elizabeth Elliot, who was still a missionary in the area. Eventually, Mankuma and Mintaka invited Rachel Saint and Elizabeth Elliot and Dayuma to return with them to their village and live. Rachel and Elizabeth and Dayuma accepted the invitation and were welcomed into the tribe. Of course, there were those members of the tribe who were suspicious of the 2 women. They wondered why no one had ever tried to avenge the deaths of the 5 men. Perhaps the 2 women had come to spy on them and tell other Kawodi where to find them and kill them. Dayuma, Rachel, and Elizabeth tried to calm their fears. They told them they had come in peace and that there was another way besides killing to deal with what had happened at Palm Beach. Slowly, as the 3 women lived among the Aka, the fog of generations of hatred and killing began to lift, and many in the tribe came to understand there would be no revenge for the killings. A new concept, one which they had no word for in their language, began to take root in their hearts. The concept was forgiveness. In 1961, Rachel and Elizabeth watched as the first group of Warani, or Aka, Christians was baptized by Dr. Ev Fuller from the mission hospital at Shelmera. Shortly afterwards, Elizabeth Elliot returned to live in the United States. Rachel remained in Ecuador and lived among the Warani for the rest of her life. She died in 1994, 38 years after her brother had been buried in Aka soil. Rachel, too, was buried there. 43 years had passed since Nate Saint first pointed out Aka territory to Rachel and said, "Sis, those are your people." How right he had been. He never dreamed, however, that it would be his own death and the deaths of the other 4 men on Palm Beach that would help the Aka to understand the meaning of forgiveness and set the stage for his sister to introduce the greatest story of forgiveness ever told. The legacy of the 2 Saint siblings buried not far from each other in Aka territory is that today approximately 1 out of 10 Akas is a Christian, and those believers are sharing a message with the rest of the tribe. It is the same message that Nate's death and Rachel's life among them so clearly illustrated. It is God's message of love, hope, and forgiveness. And then the epilogue says, in 1967, Marge Saint married Abe Vanderpuy, who had become the head of HBCJ in Quito. Abe's first wife died of cancer. Between the 2 of them, they have 6 children. In 1970, Kathy Saint married Ross Drown, the son of Frank Drown, Nate's good friend, who led the expedition to recover and bury the bodies of the 5 men at Palm Beach. And so it is that Frank and Nate share the same grandchildren, 2 boys, Brent and Darren, who are both graduates of the Air Force Academy. Flying seems to run in the family. In 1994, a Waorani, or Aka man, found a strange metal object in the sand beside the Karari River. It turned out to be the remains of Nate's Piper cruiser airplane, brought to the surface by floodwaters after 38 years of being buried. Steve Saint, also a pilot, organized a team to recover the remains, which now stand at MAF's headquarters in Redlands, California, as a silent witness to early mission aviation. That same year, Steve Saint helped the Waorani bury his Aunt Rachel. After the funeral, Waorani Christians asked him to come and take Rachel's place. At first, the idea seemed laughable. Steve had a wife, 4 teenage children, and a business to run in Florida. But as he prayed, he stopped laughing and started packing. God had called him, like he had called his parents and his aunt before him, to the Ecuadorian jungle. In 1995, Steve, his wife Ginny, and their 4 children moved to Ecuador to live among the Waorani. Together, they are looking for ways to enable the Waorani to take responsibility for the spiritual and physical needs of the tribe so they can protect their territory, identity, and way of life. With Steve's help and encouragement, they have carved a tribal center from the virgin jungle and built an airstrip, a medical and dental clinic, and a school. The growing Waorani church is playing an important role in the development of their tribe. Members of the church are building a small airplane, which they will use to transport patients and medicine to and from the clinic, and take church elders to share the gospel message in those Waorani villages that have not heard it yet. Nate Saint would have been pleased.